Hello guys and welcome back. So we are looking at the topic of immigration to Britain, which is the final topic in the AQA GCSE Power and the People course. And in my previous video, I talked about why people came to Britain and what the initial reaction was of British people to that migration. Now, this video, we're going to concentrate on what happens next. So kind of the real chunky middle bit of, well, once people have arrived, what happens? How do the British public react? And how does the government start to change legislation in order to deal with the problems that arise? So one of the first problems is that from the influx of people arriving from the Caribbean and from Asia, we see groups of young white men start to form called Teddy Boys. Now, in the 1958, blood is spilt, and we see the race riots in Notting Hill. This results in dozens of arrests and many injuries, thousands of pounds of damage, and it really proves to us that race relations in Britain are at an all-time low. So the Notting Hill race riots were triggered by an assault against a Swedish woman who had been arguing with her Jamaican husband outside Latimer Road Underground. Now, a group of white people had tried to intervene into this as they were just arguing, as couples do, and a small fight had broken out between the Jamaican man and the white men getting involved. Now, the following day, the Swedish woman was then verbally and physically assaulted by a gang of white youths who were likely to be Teddy Boys, who had seen her the night before. They were using racial slurs about the fact that she was a white woman with a black man. So highly offensive, racist language. And this triggered what we call the Notting Hill race riots. So what happened was a mob of 300 to 400 white people, mainly young men, were seen on Bramley Road attacking the houses of West Indian residents. These disturbances and attacks continued every night until the 5th of September, and were carried out by Teddy Boys. Because of this event, 140 people were arrested and 108 were charged. There were lots of moments of conflict, physical conflict between the two sides. We had the use of alcohol, homemade alcohol bombs, Molotov cocktails where you could make little bombs and fire bombs. And we had effectively at one point, these black communities were trapped inside their houses as they were being attacked from the outside. Of those arrested, of the 140 people arrested, 108 were charged, and 72 of those were white and 36 of those were black. Now, the final, sentencing was 9 white youths were sentenced, and they were sentenced to quite a severe punishment, 5 years in prison and a £500 fine, which at the time was quite a lot of money. Now, this was seen as kind of an example of, we need to stop this racial violence. And it's actually quite a milestone, I guess, in British history, because we saw 9 white people being sentenced and nobody else was sentenced. This shows that at this moment, at least the judge in that case was not taking a racist attitude and just immediately going to sentence and imprison the black community when this wasn't really their fault. Now, one nice thing, I guess, that came out of the Notting Hill race riots, which you might have heard of, is the Notting Hill Carnival. Now, the Notting Hill Carnival takes place on the site of the race riots to kind of commemorate the diversity and the culture of that community, but also the fact that we now have such a more accepting and diverse society. Now, it's really important to note that the riots were kind of an indication that relations were not very good. And if we can tell that from looking back on history, those present absolutely could tell it. And it becomes kind of a moment where the government have to take stock. Now, on top of the race riots, we see a trend from factory owners who are often unwilling to employ black workers, and segregation with housing becomes an even bigger problem. There really is a very tangible means real, you can really sense it, a real tangible feeling at the time that there were just too many immigrants. And I've just put some numbers up to show how many people were arriving into Britain. Now, obviously, we know today this is absolutely not a problem, and it's part of why Britain is such a great society, that we have such a diverse community. If you think for people living at the time who prior to the Windrush have not seen that much immigration from many communities, you can understand why it might have felt like a lot of people were arriving in quite a short space of time. So in 1948, with the Windrush, we had 492 people arrive on Windrush, and 1958 we had 17,000 Caribbean immigrants and 11,000 Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. And then by 1961, in that year, there were 62,000 people from the Caribbean and 50,000 from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So immigration is absolutely increasing, with lots of people trying to take advantage of the British Nationality Act and the opportunities available in Britain. This was only going to complicate matters in Britain itself, and I guess effectively kind of damage the dream that many of these people had at the time, because the more people that came in, the worse the racism got, and I guess the worse the situation people are arriving to. Now, by the 60s, the government realised they had to do something about this, because violence and the riots had kind of really emphasised that this was a problem that was boiling over and needed to be addressed. So they wanted to do two things. They wanted to curb the number of immigrants coming into the country, and they wanted to tackle the racial discriminative problem that had then developed within Britain itself. So to try and minimise racism and discrimination, but also to minimise the number of people arriving into Britain. So the first thing the government did in terms of legislation was, in 1962, they passed the Commonwealth Immigration Act. Now, this controlled immigration of all Commonwealth passport holders except those with British passports. Immigrants now needed a work voucher before they came to Britain, and they could only get this voucher if they had skills that were needed in Britain. This meant that doctors and nurses were less able to find employment, because we had enough doctors and nurses in Britain itself. So it's a little bit like what places like Australia have today in terms of their immigration policy, where actually you can only get visas to enter if you have a skill that is needed. It prioritises those already living in the country for jobs and things like that. This was seen, obviously, by many as a racist policy that was limiting people being able to come into Britain. Now, in 1964, a general election was called, and all those who had voted against these new immigration reforms were not re-elected. This was a clear sign that people in Britain wanted more controls over immigration. Now, in 1968, we had another law, which was the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, and this was even tighter controls on immigration. This extended restrictions to all those from the Commonwealth, regardless of whether they had a British passport or not. You had to have a parent or grandparent who was a citizen of the UK to move there. This, again, was seen as increasingly racist and unfair. Okay, I'm just going to go into a small grade 9 snippet for you. And the Act in 1968 was a reaction primarily to a new political system that had been established in Kenya. Now, Kenya had gained independence from Britain in 1963. And by this point, they were really following a policy of Africanization. This meant that many Asians living in Kenya had felt the new policy would discriminate against them, and it led to around 200,000 Asians from Kenya trying to move to Britain. So the new policy trying to kind of then curb and limit this immigration into Britain was a direct reaction to this new influx of people who wanted to leave and enter Britain by 1968. Now, the last piece of legislation we'll look at in this kind of first section of what they do to try and curb immigration is the Immigration Act in 1971. Now, this was passed by a Conservative government, which, well, you know, as I guess stereotypically goes, it showed even more tighter controls. It replaced employment vouchers with work permits, which gave only temporary residence in Britain, which meant that people only had a certain length of time to stay before they were expected to go back to their home country. So I guess in the past, when we look at this course, we see the Conservative government as trying to stick to kind of more traditional means of governance, and it was more the Labour Party or the Whig Party who wanted more reform. And I guess in the same way, we're seeing similar kind of aspects in the 1900s. So the government were also willing, they said, to assist you moving back to your original country. So they would help you with the money for the fare, and they would help you regain your old country's citizenship. So these are all methods in which the government tried to curb and to limit immigration. Now, on the other hand, we also see some pieces of legislation passed to try and deal with the racist issue, to try and deal with the discrimination that these communities were feeling. And these were the Race Relations Acts, and these were laws that were intended to improve relations between the different communities. So we see three Race Relations Acts in particular, and the first one was passed in 1965. This prevented racial discrimination in housing and employment. However, it brought no criminal convictions, so is seen as a failure. A second one followed in 1968, which was the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which aimed to help the integration of immigrant communities. And finally, in 1976, with the Race Relations Act, which extended the definition of discrimination to any practice that disadvantaged another group. A commission for racial equality was also established at this point, which had greater powers and was able to kind of do more about trying to prosecute where this wasn't happening. However, by the early 1970s, the government had done little to reassure the Black and Asian communities of Britain that they were equal and welcome. And the Black community had by this point become even more disillusioned with the police and government policies. This then leads to our final video, which please go and click on, about what happened in terms of conflict to kind of finish off the course.